Security, escort her out. She's clearly lost. The words landed loud enough to ripple across the rooftop, cutting through the soft jazz and the clink of crystal glasses like a blade no one expected, and for a moment the entire luxury condo launch froze in place under the golden glow of suspended lights and a skyline that stretched for miles beyond the glass railing. Naomi Carter didn't move, not when the laughter followed, not when a few heads turned with quiet judgment, not when Lucas Whitmore adjusted his cufflinks like he'd just handled a minor inconvenience instead of a person. She stood there in dark jeans and a fitted black blazer, no designer logo, no visible signal that she belonged among investors discussing seven-figure units measured in square feet and prestige, and that was the point, because Naomi had walked into rooms like this her entire life and watched how quickly people decided who mattered and who didn't. The air shifted as a security guard took a step forward, hesitant but obedient, his hand hovering just enough to signal intent without making contact, and that was when phones began to rise, not all of them, just enough to matter, a woman near the champagne bar whispering to her friend, a man near the model display quietly recording, curiosity spreading faster than discomfort. Naomi's eyes moved once across the crowd, calm, observant, absorbing every reaction like data being filed away for later use. Lucas smirked, feeding off the attention. His voice lower now but still sharp. This is a private investor event, not a walkthrough, and a few guests chuckled, not because it was funny, but because it was safe to agree, because in spaces like this agreement often disguised itself as belonging. Naomi tilted her head slightly, not in confusion but in recognition, like she had seen this exact moment play out years ago in a different city, a different building, when a younger version of herself had stood in a leasing office and been told units in her price range were no longer available, even though she could see the listings still open behind the agent's shoulder. That memory didn't sting anymore, it sharpened, it refined, it built something quiet and unshakable, and now here she was again, in a place built on image, being measured by one. The guard stepped closer, clearing his throat softly as if unsure how far to go. The crowd leaned in without moving, anticipation settling over the rooftop like a second layer of heat, and Naomi finally spoke, her voice steady, controlled, not loud but somehow carrying farther than Lucas's had. You're making a very expensive mistake. The words didn't challenge, they warned, and for a split second something flickered across Lucas's face, doubt, irritation, maybe both, but it vanished just as quickly as it came, replaced by a dismissive laugh that echoed just a little too long. I think we'll manage, he replied, gesturing toward the exit like the decision had already been made, like she was already gone. But Naomi didn't turn, didn't step back, didn't even shift her stance. She simply reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone, not rushed, not dramatic, just deliberate, as if every second unfolding around her was already part of something larger, something already in motion, and somewhere behind the glass walls, unseen by the crowd sipping champagne and watching the scene like entertainment, a system was about to change, numbers about to move, and a room full of people who thought they understood power were about to realize they had just watched it walk in unnoticed. Naomi's thumb moved once across the screen, a single tap, precise and unhurried, and somewhere far from the rooftop but directly connected to it a sequence began to unfold, invisible to everyone still watching her like she was the disruption instead of the center of something far bigger. Lucas shifted his weight slightly, impatience creeping into his posture as the guard hesitated again, caught between instruction and instinct, because there was something about Naomi's stillness that did not match the narrative being forced onto her. It did not match someone out of place, it did not match someone uncertain, it matched control, and control in a room like this was supposed to belong to people like Lucas, not to someone he had already dismissed. We are done here, Lucas said again, louder this time, reinforcing his authority for the benefit of the audience that had quietly formed around them. But the audience was no longer passive, whispers had changed tone, curiosity turning into tension. One investor glanced down at his phone as if reacting to something unrelated, then paused, brows tightening. Another did the same, then another, a ripple that started small but carried weight. Naomi did not look at them yet. She kept her eyes on Lucas, measuring him the way he had measured her minutes earlier, except her calculation ran deeper, years deeper, built from moments where rooms like this had decided her limits before she ever spoke. She remembered standing outside a model unit years ago, not as a buyer but as someone studying how deals were made, how spaces were controlled, how access was granted or denied with nothing more than tone and assumption. She had learned then that ownership was never just about property, it was about who decided who belonged, and that lesson had followed her into every acquisition, every negotiation, every silent move that built the portfolio. No one in this room had bothered to connect to the woman standing in front of them now. The guard lowered his hand slightly, uncertainty winning over instruction, and that subtle shift did not go unnoticed. Lucas saw it and his jaw tightened. "Do your job," he muttered, the words sharper now, less composed, and that was the first crack, small but real. Because control was starting to slip, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way that mattered most, behind the scenes, inside systems that people like Lucas trusted without understanding. Naomi's phone buzzed once in her hand, a soft vibration that did not demand attention but confirmed movement, confirmation that the process had begun. She lifted her gaze slightly, not to the skyline, not to the crowd, but to the glass doors leading back inside where a digital display board listed unit availability and investor allocations. Numbers that had not changed all evening, numbers that defined the structure of the entire event, and then one of them flickered, just for a second, subtle enough to be missed unless you were already looking. But one investor near the entrance was looking. His expression shifted immediately, confusion first, then something closer to concern. He tapped his screen again as if refreshing data that suddenly no longer matched what he had been told minutes earlier. Naomi finally turned her head slightly, her voice calm, almost conversational. "You might want to check your listings," she said, not as a suggestion, not as a warning, but as a statement of fact. Lucas frowned, dismissive at first, but the shift in the room was no longer theoretical, it was visible now. More phones lighting up, more eyes dropping away from Naomi and toward screens that were quietly rewriting the narrative of the night. And for the first time since he had spoken, Lucas did not have the room's full attention anymore, and that loss, subtle as it was, marked the moment everything began to turn. Lucas did not move at first, but his eyes flicked toward the display behind the glass, then down to his own phone, and that hesitation said more than anything he could have spoken, because confidence in rooms like this was supposed to be immediate, automatic, unquestioned, and now it was none of those things. A man near the edge of the rooftop let out a quiet breath as he refreshed his screen again, then again, as if repetition might correct what he was seeing, but the numbers did not return to what they were. They shifted further. Allocations changing, units graying out one by one as if being claimed in real time. Another investor stepped closer to the glass, squinting at the board, his voice low but sharp. "That cannot be right." And that was the moment the crowd stopped watching Naomi as an outsider and started watching the system itself unravel in front of them. Lucas forced a laugh, thin and strained. "It is probably a display glitch," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, more phones lit up, more confirmations came through, and the consistency of it made the explanation collapse before it could take hold. Naomi remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, but her presence now carried something different, something heavier, not because she had raised her voice or demanded attention, but because the room had begun to shift toward her without being told to. She glanced once toward the skyline, the city lights stretching out in perfect lines, buildings she knew, deals she had closed, spaces she had transformed, each one built on moments like this that no one ever saw, moments where perception broke just enough for reality to step in. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message she did not need to read, because she already knew what it confirmed. The sequence was complete, the structure had moved, and the room they stood in was no longer what it had been 10 minutes ago. Lucas took a step forward now, closer to her, as if proximity might restore control. "What did you do?" he asked, and this time there was no laughter in his voice, only a tight edge that betrayed the pressure building underneath. Naomi met his gaze fully, calm and direct. "I made a decision," she said, and the simplicity of it cut deeper than any explanation could have. Behind them the display board updated again, faster now, entire tiers of units shifting status, reserved, pending, closed, words that meant everything in this space, words that defined who held power and who did not. A woman near the center of the crowd lowered her glass slowly, eyes wide as she whispered, "That is the entire East Wing," and the realization spread outward like a wave, because this was not a small adjustment, not a single purchase, not a late entry into the event. This was control being established at scale, in real time, in front of witnesses who had arrived expecting to watch opportunity, not lose it. Lucas shook his head once, almost instinctively rejecting what he could not yet process. "That is not possible," he said, but the room no longer responded to his certainty. It responded to the data in their hands, to the changes they could see, to the undeniable shift happening without his permission. Naomi took one step forward now, not aggressive, not rushed. just enough to close the distance he had tried to create earlier, and in that movement the entire balance of the night flipped. She was no longer the one being evaluated, she was the one defining the outcome, and everyone could feel it, even before she said a single word more. The silence that followed was not empty, it was charged, thick with the kind of tension that only shows up when reality begins to contradict authority, and for the first time since the night began Lucas did not have an answer ready. His eyes moved between Naomi and the screens around him as if searching for a version of events that still placed him in control, but that version was gone, replaced by something he did not initiate and could not stop. Another notification sound echoed from somewhere in the crowd, then another, each one small on its own but together forming a rhythm that pulled attention away from him completely. Investors who had arrived confident in their early access were now refreshing dashboards, calling assistants, whispering into phones with urgency that had not existed minutes ago. Naomi watched it unfold without interruption, her expression unchanged, not satisfied, not amused, just certain. Because this moment was not about surprise for her, it was confirmation, the natural result of a decision already made long before she stepped onto this rooftop. Lucas took a breath and straightened slightly, trying to reclaim some version of command. If this is some kind of stunt, he began, but the sentence did not land. It dissolved midair because no one was looking at him anymore. Even the guard who had been instructed to remove her had stepped back half a pace. His posture no longer aligned with Lucas but with the shift happening in front of him. And that shift was undeniable now. The display behind the glass updated again, a full column of premium units transitioning to closed status, not reserved, not pending, closed, finalized, removed from availability entirely. A man near the center of the crowd let out a quiet laugh that carried disbelief more than humor. That is over $40 million, he said under his breath, but everyone heard it, because numbers like that cut through noise faster than anything else. Lucas turned sharply toward the display, then back to Naomi, and in that movement something changed in his expression, not just confusion now but recognition, the kind that arrives too late to prevent what is already in motion. Naomi stepped forward again, one more measured step, closing the final distance between them, and when she spoke her voice did not rise, it did not need to, it carried because the room had already given her its full attention. You asked what I did, she said, each word deliberate. I removed uncertainty. She paused just long enough for the weight of it to settle. I bought it. The words were simple, almost understated, but they landed heavier than anything else said that night, because now there was no interpretation left, no room for doubt, just fact. Lucas blinked once, slowly, as if trying to process something his mind had not prepared for. That is not possible, he repeated, but this time the word sounded smaller, detached from the authority he had relied on earlier. Naomi held his gaze, steady, unflinching. It already is, she replied. And behind them another update confirmed it, the final units in the east wing shifted status, completing the sequence, completing the acquisition, completing the moment. The crowd did not erupt, it did not need to. The reaction was quieter, deeper, heads turning, whispers spreading, alliances shifting in real time as people recalculated what they were standing in, what they had witnessed, who they had just dismissed, and who now controlled the outcome of the entire project. Naomi did not look at the crowd. She did not acknowledge the phones or the sudden attention. Her focus remained exactly where it had started, on the man who had tried to define her place in a room she now owned, and in that stillness the balance of power settled completely, final and irreversible. No one clapped, no one spoke loud enough to break what had settled over the rooftop, because what had just happened was too precise, too controlled to feel like a spectacle. It felt like a correction, like something that had always been inevitable but had finally revealed itself in real time. Lucas stood there with his shoulders slightly squared but no longer commanding, the posture of authority still present but hollow now. Disconnected from the outcome unfolding around him, he glanced once more at his phone, then at the display, then back at Naomi as if repeating the sequence might produce a different answer, but every path led to the same place. She owned it, not a portion, not a symbolic share, but enough to define everything that happened next. A woman near the edge of the crowd lowered her voice as she spoke into her phone. Cancel my meeting tomorrow. I need to reassess this entire position. And that sentence carried further than she intended, because others heard it and recognized themselves in it. Deals were shifting before they were even discussed, decisions being rewritten in the quiet space between realization and reaction. Naomi let the moment breathe, not rushing it, not filling it with explanation, because power did not need explanation when it was this clear. She turned slightly toward the glass doors again, her reflection faint against the city lights. And for a brief second she saw not just herself but every version of herself that had walked into rooms like this and been measured incorrectly, underestimated, filtered out before being understood. She remembered standing beside her mother at an open house years ago, watching the agent speak past them to another couple who had arrived later, answering their questions first, offering them options that had never been mentioned to them, and how her mother had simply taken her hand and said, "We will build our own doors." That sentence had stayed with her, not as motivation but as instruction. And tonight it had come full circle. Lucas cleared his throat, the sound small but noticeable in the quiet. "If this is accurate," he began, choosing his words carefully now, each one weighed against a reality he could no longer ignore, "then we need to discuss terms." And there it was, the shift made audible, not in tone but in language, no longer dismissing, no longer directing, now negotiating, now asking. Naomi turned back to him fully, her gaze steady but not hostile, simply resolved. "You already had terms," she said, her voice even. "You just did not realize who you were presenting them to." A few heads in the crowd tilted slightly, absorbing that, understanding it on a level that went beyond this single moment, because it was not just about a deal, it was about how quickly assumptions had been made and how completely they had been wrong. Lucas nodded once, a reflex more than agreement, his mind catching up to a situation that had already passed him by. Behind him the display board remained unchanged now, stable in its new state, the project no longer an opportunity to be pitched but an asset already secured. And that stability carried a different kind of weight, finality. Naomi took a small step back, not retreating but repositioning, no longer at the center of confrontation but at the center of ownership, and the difference between those two positions was everything. The guard who had been instructed to remove her now stood off to the side, hands relaxed, his role dissolved without a word, and in that silent shift the room completed its transformation, not through noise or spectacle but through recognition. Naomi glanced once across the crowd, not seeking approval, not acknowledging validation, just observing. And then she spoke again, softer this time but just as clear. "The launch is over," she said, letting the words settle. Now it becomes something else, and no one questioned what that meant, because they were already watching it happen. The words settled into the air with a weight that no one could ignore, not because they were loud, but because they carried authority that had already proven itself, and the rooftop that had started the evening as a stage for persuasion now felt like a room waiting for instruction. Lucas exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just enough to reveal what had been hidden beneath the polished confidence he wore earlier, uncertainty, real and immediate. He glanced toward the group of investors who had once leaned toward him for direction, but now their attention had shifted entirely, some watching Naomi, others studying their screens, recalculating positions that no longer aligned with the reality they had walked into. One man stepped slightly forward, adjusting his jacket as if preparing to speak, but stopped midway, as though unsure who to address first, and that hesitation marked the shift more clearly than anything else. Naomi moved past Lucas without brushing against him, without acknowledging the space he had tried to control minutes earlier, and walked toward the glass doors leading back inside, each step measured, unhurried, as if time itself had adjusted to her pace. Conversations resumed in fragments behind her, low voices piecing together what had just happened. She closed the entire east wing. Someone whispered, "No, more than that." Another replied, "She controls the board now," and the words carried a mix of disbelief and respect that had not been there before. Naomi paused just before the door, her reflection clearer now against the interior lights, and for a brief moment she stood still, not out of hesitation but recognition. This was the exact kind of threshold she had spent years learning to cross without permission. Lucas turned toward her again, his voice steadier now but different, stripped of assumption. "We can restructure the rollout," he said, the phrasing careful, deliberate, an attempt to regain relevance in a conversation that had already moved beyond him. Naomi did not turn immediately. She let the silence answer first, then glanced over her shoulder just enough for her voice to carry back across the room. "You are not restructuring anything," she said, calm, precise, not dismissive but definitive, and the clarity of it left no room for interpretation. A few investors exchanged looks, subtle nods passing between them as they adjusted to the new alignment of power, because in spaces like this people adapted quickly when the truth became undeniable. Naomi pushed the door open and stepped inside, the interior quieter, more controlled, the hum of conversation replaced by the soft echo of her footsteps against polished floors. Behind her the rooftop remained active but altered, no longer the center of control but a place reacting to decisions already made. Lucas followed a few steps in, not close enough to challenge, not far enough to disengage. Caught between roles he no longer fully held, Naomi walked toward the central display console inside, the one that mirrored the data from outside but with greater detail, the foundation of the entire project laid out in numbers, phases, ownership structures. She stopped in front of it, her eyes scanning quickly, confirming what she already knew, everything aligned, every shift accounted for, every unit placed exactly where it needed to be, and in that moment the scale of what she had done settled fully into the room. Not just a purchase, not just a takeover, but a complete redefinition of control. She rested her hand lightly on the edge of the console, grounding the moment, then spoke. Without raising her voice, this project was designed to filter people before they even stepped inside, she said, not looking at Lucas but knowing he was listening. I removed the filter. The words were not an accusation, they were a statement of change, and behind her the room absorbed it, the meaning extending beyond the numbers on the screen, beyond the contracts and the allocations, into something deeper, something structural. And for the first time that night the space itself felt different, not just owned, but redefined. The room did not return to normal, it recalibrated, conversations resumed but in lower tones, more measured, as if everyone present understood they were now operating inside a different set of rules. Naomi remained at the console, her reflection steady in the glass, while the data in front of her continued to update in subtle increments, confirmations locking into place, legal acknowledgements processing in the background. Each one silent but significant. She traced a single line of numbers with her eyes, not because she needed to verify them, but because she respected what they represented, years of strategy condensed into seconds of execution. Behind her Lucas stopped a few feet away, no longer trying to close the distance, his position now defined by observation rather than control. You planned this, he said, the statement quieter than anything he had said before, stripped of performance. Naomi did not turn. I prepared for it, she replied, the distinction intentional, because preparation meant readiness, not reaction. It meant the moment had been anticipated long before it arrived. A woman from the rooftop stepped inside, heels echoing softly against the floor, her phone still in her hand. The board is asking for confirmation, she said cautiously, unsure whether to address Lucas or Naomi. That uncertainty lingered for a second too long. Naomi answered without hesitation. They already have it, she said, and as if on cue the woman's phone buzzed, her eyes widening slightly as she read the update, then nodded once, almost instinctively, as if acknowledging a hierarchy that had just become clear. More people began to filter inside. Not crowding, not rushing, but drawn by the gravity of what had shifted, their voices blending into a low hum of recalculation, of questions forming and dissolving in real time. Naomi finally turned from the console, facing the room fully, and in that turn there was no announcement, no dramatic reveal, just presence, complete and undeniable. She looked across the faces now studying her with a different kind of attention. Not curiosity anymore, but recognition, and for a brief moment the room held still again, not out of tension this time, but alignment. She remembered another room years ago, smaller, less polished, where she had sat across from a panel of executives explaining a proposal they had already decided to reject before she finished speaking. How one of them had leaned back and said, "We are not sure you understand the scale of this project," and how she had nodded then, not arguing, not correcting, just storing the moment, because understanding did not need to be proven. In that room, it needed to be executed later, and now here it was, the scale they had questioned, realized in full. She stepped away from the console, her movement drawing a subtle shift in the crowd as space opened for her without being asked. Lucas watched that shift, the way people adjusted around her now instead of away from her, and something in his posture settled, not acceptance, not yet, but acknowledgement of a position he could not reclaim. Naomi paused near the center of the room, her voice calm as she spoke. Access points will change, she said, not raising her tone, but ensuring it carried. Allocation structures will be reviewed, and participation will be based on alignment, not appearance. The words were clear, structured, not emotional, but they carried a weight that extended beyond the project itself, because everyone in that room understood what had just been replaced, what had just been removed, and what would now take its place. A man near the back nodded slowly, almost to himself, as if recognizing a shift he had not expected to witness firsthand. Lucas exhaled once, longer this time, then spoke again, not to challenge, but to clarify his place in what remained. "And my role?" he asked, the question direct now, without pretense. Naomi met his gaze, not with hostility, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, that depends on whether you can operate in a system you did not design, she said, and the room absorbed the answer in silence, because it was not just his question being answered, it was everyone's. The silence did not break after her answer, it deepened, settling into the kind of quiet that forces people to confront themselves rather than the moment. Lucas held her gaze for a second longer than before, not out of defiance but calculation, as if weighing whether adaptation was even possible, and around him the room continued its slow transformation, conversations no longer centered on opportunity but on positioning. Investors speaking in lower tones, adjusting language, shifting from assumption to inquiry. A man near the glass wall stepped closer to Naomi, not interrupting, just waiting for a pause that might allow him to speak, and when she gave a slight nod he leaned in, respectful. If participation is being reassessed, how will access be determined? His voice careful, stripped of entitlement. Naomi turned slightly toward him, acknowledging the question without losing the center of the room. By alignment, she said. The word simple but deliberate, capital still matters, but it is no longer the only qualification. The man nodded slowly, absorbing that, understanding that the structure he had relied on had just expanded beyond the boundaries he had been comfortable with. Behind him another investor whispered to her colleague, "This changes everything," and she was right, not just for the project, but for how access itself would now be defined within it. Lucas shifted again, his posture less rigid now, the sharp edges of authority replaced by something more measured. "You are rewriting the framework mid-launch," he said, not accusing, just stating what he saw. Naomi met his words without hesitation. "No," she replied, "I am revealing what the framework should have been," and that distinction settled into the room with clarity, because it reframed everything that had happened, not as disruption, but as correction, a subtle but powerful shift that no one could ignore. The woman who had earlier brought the message from the board stepped forward again, her tone more confident this time. "Legal has confirmed the transfer, and they are asking for direction on public announcement," she said, this time looking directly at Naomi. No hesitation in where authority now sat. Naomi considered it for a brief second, not because she needed time, but because timing itself was part of control. "Not yet," she said. "Let the room understand it first." The decision landed with quiet precision, because she was not just managing a transaction, she was managing perception, allowing those present to process the shift before the outside world framed it for them. The display console behind her updated once more, not with new ownership changes, but with internal notes, access protocols beginning to adjust, permissions rewriting in real time, the system itself responding to her presence, and in that response, the final layer of control became visible, not just financial, but structural. Lucas watched the updates, then looked back at her, and for the first time there was no attempt to challenge, only recognition of scale. "You anticipated resistance," he said, almost to himself. Naomi gave a small nod. "I anticipated pattern," she replied, and the difference between those two words carried years of experience. Because resistance implied reaction, pattern implied predictability, something she had studied, understood, and prepared for long before tonight. A few people in the room exchanged glances, subtle acknowledgements passing between them as they adjusted their own positions within this new reality. Alliances forming quietly, recalibrations happening without formal discussion. Naomi stepped slightly to the side, allowing a clearer view of the console for those closest to her, not as an invitation, but as transparency, showing that nothing here was hidden, everything was intentional, and that openness shifted the energy again, replacing uncertainty with a cautious respect. She looked once more across the room, her voice steady as she spoke. "This project is no longer about who gets in first," she said, "it is about who builds it right," and the statement carried beyond the walls, beyond the moment, into something larger, something that would outlast the night itself, and in the quiet that followed, no one questioned her authority to say it. The room did not rush to respond, it absorbed, recalculated, adjusted in silence that felt more deliberate than any reaction could have been. Naomi stood at the center of it without claiming attention, because attention had already aligned itself with her. The console behind her continued its quiet updates, not dramatic, not disruptive, just steady confirmations that everything now operated under a different authority. One investor stepped forward again, slower this time, more aware of the weight of the moment. "If this becomes the new structure," he said carefully, "what happens to the existing commitments?" His tone carried something new, not entitlement, not assumption, but caution. Naomi looked at him, not dismissing the question, but placing it within the context of everything that had just changed. "Commitments built on limited access will be reviewed," she said, each word clear, Commitments built on value will remain. The distinction landed immediately, dividing the room. In a way no one could ignore, some faces relaxed, others tightened slightly, not out of disagreement, but realization, because value was no longer something they could declare, it was something that would now be measured differently. Lucas listened closely, his position no longer central but still present, his eyes tracking the reactions around him as much as Naomi's words. "You are going to lose people," he said, not as a warning, but as an observation shaped by years inside systems that depended on exclusivity. Naomi did not hesitate. "Then they were never aligned," she replied, and the simplicity of it removed any room for negotiation on that point. A quiet murmur moved through the space, not loud enough to challenge, but enough to signal that the line had been drawn. A woman near the back stepped closer, her voice steady. "And those who stay," she asked, "what do they gain?" Naomi shifted her gaze to her, acknowledging the question fully. "Clarity," she said, then added after a brief pause, "and access without distortion." The words carried a different kind of weight, not financial, but structural, and for a few in the room that mattered more than anything else. The console behind her reflected another update, internal permissions expanding, new review layers activating, the system itself adapting to the philosophy she had just stated. Lucas glanced at the screen, then back at Naomi, and for the first time his expression settled into something closer to understanding than resistance. "You are not just changing ownership," he said quietly, "you are changing the rules of entry." Naomi gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in confirmation that he had finally caught up to the reality of it. "The rules were always there," she replied, "they were just invisible to the people they excluded," and that sentence carried beyond the room, beyond the project, into something deeper that no one present could fully ignore. The guard who had once been instructed to remove her now stood near the entrance, watching the shift with a different posture, no longer acting, just witnessing, as if aware that what had happened went beyond a single instruction or a single moment. It was systemic, and it had just been rewritten in front of him. Naomi stepped away from the console again, her movement subtle but intentional. Drawing the room's attention without demanding it, she looked across the faces now aligned. Not by status but by awareness, and in that alignment there was something new forming, not agreement, not yet, but possibility. "This space will reflect who builds it," she said, her voice steady, "not who was first to claim it," and the distinction settled in, reshaping how the project would be understood from this point forward. Lucas exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering further, the last traces of earlier authority replaced by something quieter, more grounded. "Then we start over," he said, not as a command, but as an acknowledgement. Naomi met his gaze one more time, not to confirm, not to deny, but to recognize that the shift had reached him too, and in that moment the room did not feel divided anymore. It felt reset, not empty, but ready for something that had not been possible before. The reset did not feel like a beginning, it felt like a correction catching up to itself, the kind that does not ask permission before it settles into place. Naomi stood where she was as the room adjusted around her, not commanding movement but allowing it, and that distinction defined everything that followed. One by one conversations shifted from speculation to intention. Investors no longer asking what had happened but what would come next. A man near the center stepped forward with a tablet in hand, his tone measured. "If we are realigning, I would like to resubmit under the new structure," he said, and that single sentence carried more weight than any reaction earlier in the night, because it marked acceptance not just of her authority but of the system she had introduced. Naomi nodded once, acknowledging without praise, then "Submit with clarity," she replied, not positioning. The words were direct, removing the performance that had filled the room hours before. Another voice followed, then another, not overlapping, not competing, but aligning, each question now shaped by the framework she had set, and the room began to move with a different rhythm, slower, more intentional, like a machine recalibrating its timing after realizing it had been running off the wrong measure. Lucas remained still for a moment longer before stepping forward again, not into her space but into the conversation, his voice steady, stripped of earlier edge. "You are asking for transparency in a system that has never required it," he said, and this time it was not resistance, it was recognition of the scale of change. Naomi met his words evenly. "I am requiring it," she said, and the firmness of that distinction settled deeper than anything else, because requirement left no room for negotiation. A few people in the room exchanged glances, subtle but telling, recalculating not just their positions but their approach entirely. The console behind her reflected new entries, submissions beginning to appear under revised parameters. Not yet approved, not yet rejected, but visible, traceable, accountable, the system itself now mirroring the principle she had spoken into it. Naomi stepped slightly to the side, creating space not just physically but structurally, allowing the room to engage without obstruction, and that openness shifted the energy again, replacing hesitation with cautious participation. A woman who had remained quiet until now finally spoke, her voice steady. "This will slow things down," she said. Not complaining, just observing the reality of a process that required more than surface-level access. Naomi nodded once. "At first," she replied, "then it will remove what should not have been moving at all." The clarity of it landed immediately, because everyone in the room understood the cost of speed without substance, deals that looked right on paper but failed in practice, opportunities built on perception rather than alignment. Lucas exhaled slowly, the tension in his posture easing into something more grounded. "And the launch?" he asked. "What does it become now?" Naomi looked around the room once more, not searching, not measuring, just seeing, and in that moment the answer was already present in the way people stood, in the way they listened, in the way they had shifted from spectators to participants. "It becomes real," she said, and the simplicity of it carried a weight that no elaborate explanation could replace, because real meant accountable, real meant visible, real meant no longer filtered through assumptions that had defined access. Before, the room did not respond with applause or approval, it responded with movement, people stepping forward, devices in hand, questions forming not from entitlement but from engagement, and in that movement the final transformation completed itself, not with noise, but with alignment. Naomi remained at the center of it, not elevated, not removed, but fully present within the system she had just reshaped, and for the first time that night, the space around her did not feel like something she had entered, it felt like something she had always owned, whether anyone else had recognized it or not. What followed was not a surge of noise but a steady rise of intent, the kind that builds quietly when people realize they are no longer performing for approval but participating in something that demands substance. Naomi watched as the first formal submissions under the new structure appeared on the console, each one tagged, traceable, transparent, no longer filtered through private channels or quiet assumptions. And that visibility alone changed how people approached the process. A man who had earlier spoken with certainty now hesitated before entering his data, double-checking not just the numbers but the reasoning behind them, and that hesitation was not weakness, it was accountability. Lucas stood a few steps behind Naomi, his presence no longer dominating the space but still connected to it, observing the system he once managed begin to operate without his control. He glanced at the console, then at the individuals stepping forward one by one, and for the first time he did not try to direct them. He simply watched, learning the rhythm of a structure that did not respond to hierarchy the way his had. Naomi moved slightly along the console, her eye scanning each entry with precision, not approving yet, not rejecting, just understanding, because understanding came before decision. Always, a woman approached with a measured confidence, her voice steady. "I have revised my proposal to reflect long-term impact rather than short-term positioning," she said, and Naomi met her gaze, recognizing the shift not just in language but in intent. "Then it will be evaluated for what it builds," Naomi replied, and the exchange was brief but significant, because it set a tone others immediately recognized. This was not about who spoke first or loudest, it was about who aligned with what the project now represented. Behind them more participants stepped forward, each interaction quieter than the last, more focused, more deliberate. The room no longer carried the scattered energy of a launch event, it carried the concentrated energy of something being constructed in real time. Lucas exhaled slowly, his posture settling into something more grounded than it had been all evening. "This is slower," he said, not as criticism but as realization. Naomi did not look at him this time, her focus still on the system in front of her. "It is precise," she replied, and the difference between those two words reframed the entire process. Because precision did not waste time, it removed what did not belong. A notification appeared on the console, one submission flagged automatically for inconsistency, and before anyone else could react Naomi tapped once, opening the details, scanning quickly, then closing it just as calmly. "Rework it," she said without raising her voice. And the person who had submitted it nodded immediately, not defensive, not resistant, but aware that the standard had changed. The room absorbed that moment without tension, because it was not a rejection, it was a correction, and that distinction mattered. Naomi stepped back slightly, giving space to the console, allowing the process to continue without her constant presence at the center, and that movement signaled something deeper. The system did not depend on her standing there. It functioned because it had been designed to. Lucas watched that shift carefully, understanding now that control was no longer about proximity or visibility, it was about structure. You built this before tonight, he said quietly, and this time there was no question in it, only acknowledgement. Naomi glanced at him briefly, just enough to answer. Tonight just revealed it, she said, and the simplicity of the truth settled in. Because everything they were witnessing had been set in motion long before anyone arrived. The launch had not created the moment, it had exposed it. Around them the room continued its transformation, not chaotic, not uncertain, but aligned, each person now operating within a framework that did not rely on assumption, and in that alignment something stronger than control took shape, something sustainable, something that would not collapse under pressure because it had not been built on appearance in the first place. Naomi looked once more across the space, her presence steady, her voice calm as she spoke. What happens next will define what this becomes, she said, not directing, not commanding, just stating what was already true, and in the quiet that followed no one questioned it, because they were already part of what came next. The rhythm of the room had fully changed now, no longer driven by presentation or persuasion but by a quiet, deliberate flow of decisions being made in real time, each one grounded, each one visible. Naomi stood slightly removed from the console, not because she had stepped away from control, but because control no longer required her constant presence at the center. The system moved with intention, guided by the structure she had already put in place, and that structure was doing exactly what it was designed to do, filtering without bias, evaluating without assumption. A man who had once stood confidently near the front now returned with a revised proposal, his tone measured. I have adjusted my model to reflect long-term sustainability over immediate return, he said, and Naomi nodded once, acknowledging not just the change in numbers but the shift in mindset. Then it will be measured against impact, not speed, she replied, and the exchange carried through the room, reinforcing the standard that had replaced everything before it. Lucas stood nearby, his gaze no longer searching for control but studying the system itself, watching how people responded when the usual shortcuts were removed, when positioning could no longer replace substance. He glanced at Naomi, then back at the console, and for a moment he said nothing, because there was nothing left to argue, only something to understand. A soft chime sounded from the console, marking the first full approval under the new framework. The screen displayed it clearly, no hidden steps, no private confirmations, just a transparent decision based on alignment, and that moment, quiet as it was, shifted the energy again, because it proved that the system did not just filter, it functioned. A woman near the center exhaled slowly, almost in relief, as if witnessing something she had not expected to see in a space like this. It actually works, she said softly, not realizing she had spoken out loud. Naomi heard it, but did not respond directly. Because the proof did not need reinforcement, it stood on its own. Another submission followed, then another, each one processed with the same clarity, the same visible structure, and the room adapted, not perfectly, not instantly, but steadily, people adjusting their approach, their expectations, their understanding of what it meant to participate. Lucas finally stepped closer, not to reclaim space but to engage with it, his voice lower now, more grounded than it had been all evening. You removed the illusion, he said. And Naomi looked at him, her expression calm. No, she replied, I removed the need for it, and that distinction settled deeper than anything else, because illusion only existed where it was required, and she had just taken that requirement away. The console reflected another update, more approvals, more revisions, the system now fully active, fully aligned with the principle she had set, and in that alignment the final layer of resistance dissolved, not dramatically, not visibly, but completely. Naomi stepped forward once more, her presence steady as she looked across the room, at the people who had shifted, adapted, recalibrated, not all of them willingly, not all of them easily, but all of them undeniably. This is where it becomes permanent, she said, her voice even, carrying through the space without force. Not because I say it does, but because you choose to operate within it. The words were not a command, they were a reflection of what was already happening, and that made them stronger. Because they were true, the room did not respond with applause, it responded with continuation, people returning to the process, engaging with the system as it was, not as it had been, and in that continuation the transformation locked into place, not temporary, not conditional, but real. Naomi held the moment for a second longer, then allowed it to move without her, because it no longer depended on her standing still, it depended on what had been built, and what had been built was already holding The room no longer needed direction, it moved with intention, each person now aware that what they were part of was not just a project but a shift that would outlast the night itself. Naomi stood quietly as the system continued to process, approvals locking in, revisions refining themselves, the structure holding steady under real participation, not performance, and in that steadiness something rare had formed, trust without illusion. Lucas remained nearby, no longer positioned as the center of anything but no longer out of place either, his posture grounded, his voice measured when he finally spoke. "I misread the room," he said, not loudly, not for attention, but clearly enough to be heard, and Naomi turned slightly toward him, not to correct, not to challenge, but to acknowledge the moment for what it was. "You read what you were used to seeing," she replied, and the distinction mattered, because it separated intention from pattern, fault from structure. Lucas nodded once, slowly, absorbing it, not as defeat but as understanding. Around them the room continued to operate, no longer watching but doing, engaging with the system that had replaced assumption with clarity. A few conversations rose and fell in low tones, no longer centered on status but on substance, on what could actually be built now that the barriers no one spoke about had been removed. Naomi glanced once at the console, confirming what she already knew: the foundation was set, the structure was holding. And more importantly, it was being used the way it was meant to be. She stepped back fully now, not out of the space but out of the center, allowing the system and the people within it to continue without her constant presence, and that final step carried more weight than anything she had said, because it proved that what she had created did not rely on her standing there, it relied on what had been built correctly from the start. The rooftop beyond the glass had quieted, the earlier tension replaced by a calm that felt earned rather than imposed. The city lights stretched out the same as they had before, but the room inside no longer matched the assumptions that had filled it hours ago. Lucas followed her gaze for a moment, then spoke again, quieter this time. "You did not need to say who you were," he said, and Naomi allowed a small pause before answering, her voice steady, grounded. "I did not come here to be recognized," she said, then added, "I came here to be correct." And that sentence settled into the space with a finality that no one could misunderstand, because it reframed everything that had happened. This was never about proving identity, it was about establishing truth, about replacing a flawed system with one that could hold under scrutiny. She turned toward the exit now, not rushed, not dramatic, just finished. And as she walked, the room did not stop her, did not call after her, because there was nothing left to question, only something left to continue. The system remained active behind her, the conversations continued, the work moved forward, and that was the point. Naomi reached the door and paused for a brief second, not to look back at the people, but at the space itself, the room that had tried to define her before it understood her, now operating under a structure she had set without raising her voice, without forcing attention. Just by being precise when it mattered most. She opened the door and stepped out into the night air, the city stretching wide and steady beyond the rooftop, and inside, without announcement, without spectacle, everything she had shifted continued to hold, exactly as it was designed to.